This is Steve Wilson. Thank you for joining us today. Our webinar today is WellCare 101, what you need to know to protect your family. I'm with the State Water Survey, as well as Katie Buckley, who's here with me. And the private well class, if you're familiar with us, is sponsored, funded, and supported by RCAP, the Rural Community Assistance Partnership, and with funding through the US EPA. So I apologize for starting late. Not sure what happened there, honestly. Okay. If you're a NEHA, if you're looking for continuing education credit through NEHA, we offer that as part of this webinar series. I do want to point out that your credentialing occurs every 2 years if it's the NEHA credentialing cycle. And so as an example, if you just started your 2-year cycle on 5/1 and you take the webinar today, you can't get credit for it a second time until after 5/1/25. I listed the dates below where we've offered the same webinar, and we also offer LEHP credit for Illinois. And what we have in there's handouts. Wow, it's going to be that kind of day. Copy the slide deck, all that stuff. You just email us at info@privatewellclass.org. And I do want to point out, we even got a question about this. Someone asked if they could watch a past webinar and get credit for it. You cannot. You have to be live. We have to be able to use the analytics that come with GoToWebinar to monitor that you're actually there and paying attention and those sorts of things. So, but yeah, if you have any questions, it's info@privatewellclass.org. And yeah, we'll go on from there. So today, our webinar is actually part of our private well class program, but it's not the class itself. The class is a 10-lesson static content class that you sign up for, and it sends you 1 lesson a week for 10 weeks. These webinars support that and go into detail on certain topics, but we can't cover everything that's in the class in 1 2-hour webinar. So we certainly encourage you to sign up for the class itself. If, as far as questions go, there will be time at the end for follow-up questions. So if something that I say today you have a question about, or if I don't answer your question that you asked in advance, we'll get to a number of those, but not all of them. You can ask in the question box or the chat box. Katie will be monitoring that, and we'll pull those up at the end, which reminds me, Katie, I forgot to pull up the Google Doc, so that'll take a second when we get there. All right. So this program is funded through RCAP. So RCAP gets funding from US EPA. A small piece of that comes to us, but we work with RCAP. We're partners on this grant. They have staff in every state and a number of private well professionals who put on workshops, do well assessments, and support well owners in their local areas. So if you have an issue, especially if you would like a well assessment done and you're a well owner, let us know. We can get you to the right RCAP person to do those, and they're completely free. It's a good way to understand what vulnerabilities you might have if your cap's not on properly, or you don't have a cap. Some of those things. It's meant to be an assessment to look at your well and the information we know about the geology and all those things to better understand if you're at any kind of risk based on your well construction and geology and practices around your well. So the State Water Survey, where we're housed, is been here since 1895. We're in year 128 right now. It was started because of cholera and typhoid outbreaks in the state. So the state legislature formed the Water Survey. We're a sister agency to our State Geological Survey, which most folks are familiar with their State Geological Survey or what they do. We're a separate entity, but sister agencies, if you will, under the same umbrella at the University of Illinois. So we conduct research, we house the state's well logs, we do a lot of outreach, education, and support well owners in the communities in Illinois and through this program around the country. It's really cool to work at a place that's 128 years old. This is a from Quincy, Illinois, showing deaths by typhoid fever from 1873 to 1910. And you can see they added a filter plant in 1891. There's a lot of material like this in our files. And it's just, like I said, it's just really interesting to understand the history, how these things came about, when chlorine was first used. All that sort of stuff is all in our files and records, and it's it's a good history of advances in water treatment and those sorts of things in the United States. Yeah, this is just another example. This is an old glass plate slide, and there's a picture of it up at the top. And this was an investigation of why typhoid was occurring. Sometimes it occurred in milk. It got into a tank of milk, and people used buckets back then to pull their milk out, and we see cases like that. So here they were tracking Mr. Erickson's dairy route in Rockford, and just a handful of the 112 cases ended up being a part of that. But this plate was preserved. It's pretty cool, like I said. Yeah, I'm just, I guess, it's pretty interesting, all this stuff. You could spend a lot of time on it. So, but let's get to our presentation today. Again, I'm Steve Wilson. I'm a groundwater hydrologist at the State Water Survey, and I manage a private well class. Katie Buckley, who's with me today, is our water resources outreach specialist. She's also at the survey here, and she will be fielding your questions during the webinar. So you can ask those again in the question or chat box, and we'll try to pull those up at the end for those willing to stick around. Katie, you ready to do a poll question?
Yep, let me launch it. Hold on one second.
This helps us, and it's through our grant, to have an idea of who our stakeholders are and who's participating. So we certainly ask that you do that. And it's also a way to show, for you to show that you're here and paying attention if you're looking for continuing education credit. So
I've launched the poll question. You'll have to pardon me for my voice, but we want to know today what role best describes you as a participant on our webinar today. So select the one that best describes you. I know that you can fit into several categories potentially, but of these 5, which one would you agree that you are the most of, I guess? We'll just give it about 30 seconds. We already have about 83% of you voted, so that's great. And once the poll is closed, I'll launch the responses so everyone can see who's on the webinar today. And then I'll close the poll, and then Steve will continue on with today's presentation. All right, we have 91% in. Let's give it about awesome. 5 more seconds. So get your answers in, so it does help me issue certificates and also gauge who our audience is primarily. All right, I'm going to go ahead and close the poll, and then I will share the results. So it looks like there's pretty much a tie between well owners, health professionals, and regulatory agencies today, which is surprising, but great. All right, I will hide the poll, Steve, and then feel free to continue.
All right, thanks. Yeah, thanks for filling that out. Okay. So here's, well, start off with this webinar usually with, what's important to understand. And, these statements are for a national audience, and it's the common problems we have with wells. So they're not regulated once they're installed. Sometimes they may require testing at property transfer, but really once they're in place and been approved, it's really up to the owner and user to be sure the water's safe to drink, and also to maintain the system. So you need to treat it like you're the water operator of a very small water system, the one that's for you and your family. And the other thing to remember is that, it can be the best tasting. I know my dad always swore by our old Dug well as the best tasting water, but it certainly wasn't safe, although he thought it was. It could be the best tasting and safest in the world, but things like arsenic, you can't taste, see, or smell. So the only way you know for sure, and arsenic's a naturally occurring element in the Earth's crust. We find it in some of our aquifers. There are places like in Maine where it's a real problem in private wells. And so you have to test. That's the only way to know. And the other side of this is, now I live in town and I have a water bill, pay $40 or $50 a month for my water supply, but that's the cost that contributes to the 150,000 residents for sampling the water, for treating the water, maintaining it, and all the infrastructure, so that when I turn on my tap in my kitchen, I have clean, safe water, and there's always water pressure. You're responsible as a well owner for all of those things with your own well. And so I do want to mention that, we've been doing this a long time. We've helped well owners in Illinois for over 30 years, but even this program is almost 10 years old now. And really the two biggest problems for wells or well water quality are old construction, and I say poor construction, but typically it's old construction where it's before any kind of well code. It's an old hand dug well, or whatever it might be, and lack of well owner knowledge. It's just a lot of folks haven't taken the time to really learn what it means to be a private well owner, and that's what we're here to help change. Things to consider, well depth, deeper is generally better, and we say that in the context of if your water is coming from a deeper source, it's less influenced by surface contaminants. It's less likely that water is going to run into the ground and get into your well if your well is fairly deep, or where you're getting your water is very deep. I should change this actually, because you could have a 600-foot well, but if it's a bedrock well, it may only have 30 or 40 feet of casing. And in that case, water can get in the well from 40 feet down to 600. And so it's not well depth, it's where your water's coming from, how much casing there is before water can enter the well. That is generally better from the standpoint of surface contamination. But when you get in any aquifer, no matter how deep you are, you can have, again, natural occurring contaminants, uranium, arsenic, you name it, any metals that might be in an aquifer that are just naturally occurring. The other thing is location on the landscape. You don't want to put your well in an area that floods, for instance. I know sometimes you buy this nice 5 or 10 acre property and it's got a small bluff overlooking a small stream, and you realize, or the driller that you have come put your well in realizes that there's no water up on the bluff and they have to put your well down by the stream. Well, every spring that may flood, and so your well has to be installed in a way that it won't get overtopped and that it's properly sealed around the annulus with grout, so that you don't have any water quality issues from surface water getting in your well. And groundwater flow direction. The water table typically follows the landscape. So if you're in a subdivision in a rural area where everyone has wells, and one end is much higher than the other, maybe on the low end there's a river or a lake, assume that the flow direction of the shallow groundwater in the water table is toward the lake, towards the low end. And so the folks who are furthest up the hill, so to speak, all their septic, if everyone has septic systems, is going into shallow water table. And as you go down the hill, that kind of combines. And so if your wells are shallow in those cases, there's more risk. And just, again, knowing what's going on around your well. We see people who tie their dogs next to the well and or have stored things around their well, or their well is in a building or in their basement, where it can't be worked on, and just some common sense things about protecting the area around your well. So as far as poor construction, which again is really one of the biggest issues we see, well construction codes have changed a lot since, and I say past 50 years. Illinois passed their well construction code, their first one in 1968. So every time a well code is updated, they're grandfathered in, all the wells that already exist. We still find wells in pits, which was done in warmer or colder climates so that in the winter pipes didn't freeze. They're really risky because they can fill up with water during a heavy rainstorm. And we also still see a lot of old hand dug wells. And one thing I'll say about well codes, there's still 2 states that don't have well construction code. And so if you're from Pennsylvania or Alaska, if you want to make sure your well, you're putting in a new well, use some other state's well code and ask your driller to stick to that or get it in a contract. Because there's really, the 2 problems are they provide an opportunity for surface contamination, but especially a well pit or an old dug well, they certainly can be a safety hazard as well. Here's some examples. These are all old dug wells. The one in the top left is from the Washington State Department of Ecology. They're the state agency in Washington State that regulates drillers and well construction. This person has an old large diameter well that used a tile, and she probably stepped on that plywood hundreds of times. This time it broke and she fell and it killed her. But you can see this little well house. There's a funnel there, probably for oiling the pump. There's some gray cottony looking stuff. That's probably insulation that can fall in the well. And yeah, it's just, this is a really poor way to have your well, the water you're drinking. It's probably got a lot of stuff in it. And the picture on the right, that's a dead goat in an old well. This well wasn't being used anymore, but it wasn't sealed. And you can see the old stones down below where the original well was just an old large diameter stone well that was hand dug. And then they put a piece of concrete tile up, and it stuck up maybe 6 inches above land surface. So a nearby family's goats got loose. One of them decided to get a drink of water in there, and that's how they found it. So that's why you need to have your well covered and protected and have a proper cap. And the same with the picture on the bottom. This was a well that we were sampling for pesticides and nitrate as part of a ag chemical study back in the 90s. And there's a field up gradient on the hill. The house is fairly far away, so there's really not much water, or they wouldn't be this far away in the first place. But that's a pasture with cattle in it, and that's why those posts look so weird, because they've all been rubbed. They're scratching posts for the cattle, so they're also doing their business there. And this is a shallow hand dug well. Everything that infiltrates in the ground is going to end up in that well, and so there's no way it doesn't have bacteria and other issues, let alone things like snakes, rodents, other things that could get in there. I mean, being covered with 2x10s and pieces of tin roofing just isn't a safe way to have your water supply. So what should you do if you have an old well like that? Bring it up to code, and you need to protect your well and your water quality. So if it's in a pit, it's a drilled well, extend the pipe up to the surface and fill that in so that it's not a hazard anymore. Because these wells, people forget about them. And so there's a lot of old wells that are not sealed and they've been abandoned, but they're not properly sealed, or properly abandoned is the term, where you fill it in, and there's also a well code for that on how to seal a well. And so you can ask your local contractor or your county health department, or even maybe extension. Some of those folks can help you. And in some cases with a unused well, that's an old well on a property, because we see a lot of times in a rural area, a farm may have 3 or 4 wells and they're only using 1 or 2 of them. Yeah, the best thing to do is, they're a safety risk and people do forget about them. So getting ahead of myself. So yeah, abandoned wells, those that are unused and not sealed, because well logs weren't required until at least the 60s, and in many states later than that, 80s or 90s, there's more wells out there that are abandoned and unused that are not documented than there are wells on file. And so that can really be a dangerous thing. Like wells and pits, they're a safety hazard. And if you have an abandoned well on your property that's not sealed, you really should properly abandon it. Doing so not doing so, even if somebody's trespassing, they fall in and get hurt or killed, you're likely to be liable. And there are some, I know in Illinois, before the pandemic, I'm not sure if it's restarted, but there was a program through the Stormwater Conservation Districts where they would cost share half of the cost of abandoning a well, properly abandoning a well. So something to look into locally. Here's some more examples. These are old abandoned wells. They're pulling a horse out of the one up on top. Both of these pictures, by the way, come from the Washington State Department of Ecology as well. They have a blog, or had a blog. These pictures are a number of years old, but the one on the bottom, you know, this guy in Sheldon, Washington fell 45 feet. In his backyard, there was a well. He didn't know it, and he stepped through, fell 45 feet and walked away. Very lucky. We just had here in Illinois, we just had someone call us saying that they had a small hole in their yard and they weren't sure what it was. So a colleague and I went down there to investigate, and right in the front yard was an old dug well. They knew the house had been built in like 1916, but the well they were using was much newer than that. And so they believe it's the original well, but she ran over it with a mower and it had nothing but sod over it. And, you know, it caved in a little bit, but not enough to, I mean, it could have killed her. So it's a real issue with these old wells. And these newspaper clippings are all, again, from the 90s. You know, it just happens more than people realize. Sangamon County is where our state capital is. The other three are, well, the third one down is, those of you that are old enough remember Jessica McClure. It was covered live on CNN. It took, I don't know, 26 hours or something to get this little girl out of a well that she'd fallen into. And she's grown and a mother of three today. But it really captured the nation's attention about this issue at the time. So you should fill them in as the bottom line. So basics of well care, best management practices, BMPs. So, you know, in some states, you can drill your own well. Illinois is one of them. You can't drill it for anybody else unless you're a licensed driller, but you as a property owner can put a well on your own property without, but it's really not a good idea. There are very few people who aren't well drillers that understand the complexity. You still have to put it into code, which means you have to grout it. You have to use the proper materials. And it's just really, when you have, it's your water supply, it's what you drink every day, it's really important to make sure that that's done right. And so, you know, one thing we would recommend is using a licensed well driller. And if you're in a state, like if you're in Alaska or, well, Alaska doesn't have even, you can't even apply for a license in any way. But in Pennsylvania, anyone can get a drilling license. You just pay a $60 fee. I could send in the information and get a license to drill in Pennsylvania today. They don't require a test. They don't, there's no continuing education like there is in every other state. And so having a drilling license in Pennsylvania does not mean that they're qualified to drill a well. And it even says that on their website. And so you have to be careful where you're at. I would ask around a lot before I picked a driller and make sure you know, someone is reputable. One thing you can do is the National Groundwater Association has a master driller program, and those folks have gone through extra training to get that designation. And if you have someone in your area that is a master driller, then you have a little more assurance that they know what they're doing. All right. Every state, again, or you can find it if you're in one of those two states, has a guide and rules book on what the rules are and how you drill, what you can drill, what kind of material you can use. If there's a sensitive aquifer somewhere, they may have requirements that are different there. I know in Wisconsin, there's an aquifer that is full of arsenic. We're talking, instead of, you know, the standard is 10 parts per billion, there's an aquifer there that has 3,000 parts per billion. And so you're not allowed to put a well into that aquifer. So there's, you know, it's worth looking and understanding what the geology is in your area. Not only this handbook, like the Minnesota Department of Health one, won't necessarily go into the geology of your area, but you can contact your state or federal geological survey, or if there's another agency that does the geologic mapping in your state, or water quality folks. I know in Illinois you could contact the water survey. We have that information on water quality. But your geological survey or a similar agency, DNR in some states, will have all of that. Learn as much as you can about where your well's at, how deep it is, and what formation it's in. There may be information available, for instance, that there's 2 aquifers at your location. The upper one is, it's confined, it's underneath a clay layer, which means surface infiltration is going to be much less, but it may be high in arsenic, and where the lower aquifer isn't. And that's just a matter of how those materials were laid. Typically, if you have sand and gravel aquifers, it's either from a river, river sands, alluvial sands, or it's from glaciers. And so understanding that or having someone explain it to you is really key to understand what your own situation is, and every well is different. As far as the site, if it has a vent, make sure it has a screen, it's elevated, it should be accessible. And I brought it up earlier, we've seen wells in basements or in garages. The annulus is the area outside of the well within the borehole that was drilled to install the well. And so that should be filled with grout, which is either a cement or a clay, something that prevents water from moving down through the outside of the well casing. And it should be in an open area where it's easy to work on, especially if you have a submersible pump. And there shouldn't be anything but grass around it. And if you can have it in an elevated space, and like it says here, this example picture doesn't show it, which I probably should change this picture. The well casing is elevated, and the ground is sloped away from the well. So ideally, the ground's a little higher at the well so that water's running away from it, not ponding around it. Most states, again, and I use Minnesota a lot, and I'll just say that they put out a lot of resources for the well owners in Minnesota. They have a really strong private well program, and so there's a lot of good information available from their health department. And so I use a lot of their materials. As I look through things from all over the country, a lot of times it's the Minnesota document that is the most complete or most clear. That's what I try to do, is pick a document that is going to be the best for you all. And so every state has setback distances when you drill a new well. You think about the common things would be a septic system, whatever. But I show this one because it's a pretty complete list of all the things that can affect your well. And so you need to be aware of, that a grave is a bad idea near your well, a kennel, all those sorts of things. Here's the bottom half of that. So it just gives you food for thought. You don't want to have your well next to an electric line, for instance, because you're going to have a drill rig is going to have to put his tower up to drill it. If you have to pull the pump, they come out with a pump truck. It's also, it's just risky. And so things like that. As far as septic systems, it's one of the more common sources of contamination of wells, either of the well for the landowner that owns the septic system or someone nearby. And these are wastewater treatment systems, right? Everything comes out of your house, from your showers and toilets and sinks, dishwasher, clothes washer, and it goes into this 2-compartment tank that this one's showing, and then the solids settle at the bottom or they float, and then the second tank settles things further. There's bacteria from our bodies that are in the tank that help break all that down, and then it can harmlessly go out as the tank fills up through the drain field. And so you need to know where your tank is. you need to know where the openings are. You need to pump it on a regular schedule. When folks say things like, I add this thing to my yeast or some other product, those are totally unnecessary. And yeah, it's not been proven that they help. What helps is not putting things like, oh, I don't know the word I'm trying to think of, antibiotics. Like someone's has been sick and they were on, penicillin or something, not putting that in there that'll harm the bacteria, or other kinds of chemicals. Don't flush pills or those sorts of things. So as far as a to-do list, you need to keep the area around your tank and drain field open, only grass. Trees are a big culprit. The roots love a drain field because of the holes in the tile and its nutrients and liquid. And also you don't want to drive over it. You'll compact the soil, make it less likely that, once it leaves the pipes in the drain field, that water is further treated by bacteria in the soil and it's broke down and it becomes harmless, pretty much. And, there's certainly cases where septic systems cause problems, but then in some cases you have to have an alternative kind of septic, alternative kind of treatment system, because the septic system just won't work. It's right on top of bedrock or some other issue. You should reduce the flow into your septic system. The bacteria need time to work. That doesn't mean you have to conserve water, but you really shouldn't have your sump pump hooked to it, or your Whirlpool, or even your softener backwash. And there's arguments about that from the industry both ways, but in general, you want to find another place to discharge those things, because you're trying to protect the bacterial growth that you have in your septic tank that's breaking everything down and making it harmless. And you should only put wastewater into your septic system. No paint, pills, man-made stuff. And you should know that garbage disposals really increase the solids significantly, such that most experts say that if you have a garbage disposal, you should cut in half the time between when you pump your tank. And the problem is something like, a big piece of a carrot or some other vegetable, bacteria can't break that down in any reasonable time. It gets covered up and becomes part of the sludge in the bottom well before it could ever be broken down. And so that's, and so that's why you really shouldn't have a garbage disposal in the first place if you're on a septic. You need to inspect the tank and measure the solids, or have someone come do that. Every contractor probably has a different rule of thumb, but I think it's around 60 to 75% full. You should pump it, because eventually the solids will build up and clog, or they'll get into the drain field and clog the drain field. And when that happens, your system can no longer function. We've seen, someone sent me a video where their septic had backed up, and it was, their yard was so, their grass was so thick and nice that the water from the septic came up to underneath the grass and basically created a liquid layer on top of it. This person put their foot on the grass, and you could see it make a shock wave, like when you like a water wave. But you don't want that in your yard. And your grass starts getting greener, or it starts getting wet in an area, then you likely have a problem, because what will eventually happen is it's going to back up into your house, and then it's a real mess. So that's why you need to pump your tank on a regular schedule. There's several places out there where you can see, based on the number of people in your home, or out east, they use the number of bedrooms in a home to size a septic system. And so yes, the number of people, and then based on if it's 1,000 gallons or 500 gallons or whatever the size is, there's a chart that you can use then to determine how often you might need to actually pump out the solids. I want to talk a little bit about Septic Smart, or not Septic Smart, but septic systems on EPA's webpage. It's just epa.gov/septic. There's a ton of great tools here. Septic Smart is their program, and there's a Septic Smart week every September. It's usually the second or third week, I think. This is an older slide, obviously, but there's a lot of good information here. You can, if you don't know anything about your septic system, it's really worth going through the tools they put here and all the resources they provided. You can learn about really about anything, you know, septic systems and drinking water. It talks about how that can affect things. I was talking about groundwater flow direction earlier, and so what really determines, you know, where the water from your septic goes once it gets in the ground is the direction the water table is flowing. If it's flowing, you know, east to west, north to south, what it might be. But here's an example where the well's on one side of the house and the septic's on the other, as it should be. But once it gets to the water table, the groundwater flow direction is back towards the well. And this says, could my well be affected? It doesn't mean it will be. If the wastewater treatment in the soil, it shows number 4 there, is able to break it down, or that's quite a distance, then it may not be an issue at all. But it's something to know. You know, it'd been better if these had been flipped and the well was on the left side of the house and the septic was on the right. But a lot of times you don't know the groundwater flow direction, so it's just not an issue. Or if your house is going in next to someone who already has a lot next door and a house, then where their septic system is also affects where you can put your well. And so there's just a lot of considerations there. If you're in an area, like I'm gonna use New York as an example, upstate New York, there's a bedrock right at the surface, the aquifer, that is the aquifer. So you can't have, especially around some of the lakes, you can't have a traditional septic system. There's nowhere to put it below ground, and it'll run right into the aquifer because it's rock, and it's just fractures in the rock that allow water in. And so there you need an advanced system that treats it, and you know, it gets disposed of. You may even have to have a service to do that, but it's required given certain conditions of the soil. They have to pass certain tests and have a certain thickness of soil in order to be able to put in different kinds of systems. So this explains a lot of those products and where they're approved. And this tends to be much more advanced in the East Coast than as you move west, as far as the rules related to septic systems. So it's worth a look. They've also done a ton of webinars on some of these things, and so I just recommend that if you have a chance and you're interested in learning more, there's a lot of good information here. That was my point. So as far as testing, you know, we recommend you test your well annually, and anytime the well's been opened, or if you have something that's changed, you know, if it all of a sudden has a funny taste or odor or color. So it really, and this is a sampling project where we're working with a homeowner to look at lead issues in this picture. But yeah, that's kind of what we recommend. So what do you test for? You know, it really depends to some degree on the type of well you have. If you have a bedrock well versus a sand and gravel well, if there are any known contaminants in your area. Like we know there's an aquifer south of Champaign-Urbana, Illinois, that if you're in the shallower aquifer, it's fairly high in most of the area in arsenic. And so we definitely recommend in that area you test for arsenic, whereas in other parts of the state, we know there is no arsenic in the aquifer, and we wouldn't recommend that. So understanding some of those things, I'm going to give you a list of what we recommend, but you should always ask your county or state health department for advice if they know of any natural occurring contaminants in the area. And again, also the state agency that works with water quality data. So if you Google my state water quality, groundwater quality, it should come up what agency, whether that's DNR, DEQ, or what they might go by, or Department of Health. Whoever maps that water quality, someone there will be able to help you and understand if you have any known contaminants that you might want to check for. You could also ask locally, your driller, your neighbors, certainly, or co-op extension, one of them may already know. I know in the area where there's a lot of arsenic, those health departments are well aware of it. And so that's the first thing they would recommend to you if you called them. And then also coliform and nitrate. So we have a lot of people contact us and say, my well tested safe. They tested it for coliform and nitrate and there wasn't any. So that isn't a test to say your well's safe. That's a test to say that there's not a pathway into your well for surface contaminants. So there shouldn't be high nitrate or bacteria in your well. And if there is, it likely means that there's a pathway into your well from the surface. And that's really all it indicates. It doesn't mean it doesn't have arsenic. It doesn't mean it doesn't have, any other contaminant that could be in the ground or could be spilled near a well. It really means that the integrity of your well is probably good, and that's why you test for it regularly. Yeah. There are some states who provided additional information for well owners. This is for Massachusetts. Massachusetts DEP has this locator where you can enter your address, and it'll tell you if there's known arsenic or uranium issues at that location if you have a bedrock well. And so it's a way that you can see quickly whether or not you should test, whether you need to test for uranium. I don't know what that costs, but it's probably fairly expensive, and you wouldn't want to do that just on your own unless you had a cause to think it might be an issue. Or they may have information like this on their website. This is Rhode Island, and all those little circles are where there used to be orchards. And those areas are known to have soil and or groundwater contamination when arsenic was used as a pesticide in orchards until the 60s or late 50s. But why this is interesting is that big splotch in the middle is actually where there's known high beryllium. And I found this on their website. It's probably been close to 10 years ago. I didn't realize beryllium was a regulated contaminant, but it is. It's listed under the Safe Drinking Water Act as a contaminant that you can't have in a public water supply or community water supply. And so it has to be tested for by every municipal supply in the country. You don't see it very often, but if you live in Rhode Island in this area, it looks like, it's something you'd want to test for. And that's why I say you need to ask and be inquisitive, talk to your state and local folks and find out what might be going on in your area, because you just never know. And Wisconsin has this really nice tool. It's Wisconsin DNR is the agency that oversees private wells and community water supplies. And so they developed this website with all their private well information. And so I clicked on in the upper right, arsenic by county, and what it's showing me are counties where the groundwater, the private well samples they do have, which some states are clear, or some counties are clear, which means they don't have any data. But you can see that near Green Bay, there's 3 counties there that the average sample was over 21 micrograms per liter or parts per billion, which the standard for a community water supply is 10. And that's the other thing you'll hear a lot is, we use, and most health professionals use, what the Safe Drinking Water Act says for public water supplies as a surrogate for what's safe for a private well. So a community can serve water that has arsenic at 9 ppb because the health standard is 10. And so we would likely then follow suit and say that, if you have 9 ppb of arsenic, it's under the health standard for a community water supply, but it's up to you personally to decide if that's okay with you and if you want to do anything about it. But in this case, what's nice, if I was going to move to Green Bay and I wanted to have a private well, I'm at least going to test the well before I buy a property for arsenic, and I'm probably going to ask the homeowner if they've tested, if they've added any treatment. yeah, so it's just a lot of good information, and depends on the state what kind of information they have. So what we suggest again is coliform nitrate annually. Again, it's about the integrity of your well. And then if you've never sampled your well initially, and then we recommend every 3 to 5 years, you should sample for this list of contaminants. The zinc and cadmium is if it's galvanized piping. There's also zinc and solder. So if you have even copper or pipes, you probably would want to test for zinc. And then also ask your local or state health department or your water quality agency in the state, groundwater quality agency, as I mentioned before, if there's any other things nearby that you might want to test for. So as far as getting it analyzed, we recommend using an accredited or certified lab. Every state accredits labs because public water supplies have to get their wells get their water tested on a 3-month basis. In order to be in compliance with the Safe Drinking Water Act. And so there's labs in every state that are certified to do those samples. Some won't actually even take a private well sample. They only do public or community water supplies. But it's that versus a non-accredited lab, it's better to use an accredited lab just because they went through the process of getting the accreditation, which means they've shown that they know how to do the analysis the proper way and they use the right procedures and all those things. Some states do have programs for private well sampling. Iowa has a program, it's called the Grants to Counties program, where their state legislature gives funding to the counties for either water quality sampling or well abandonment. So if you're in Iowa, that's a great program you should call your county health department about. And also when you contact a lab, they should be able to give you detailed information. And we work with the Association of State Public Health Labs, and when we did a webinar with them a few years ago, and I just said flat out, we tell people if a lab can't answer your questions, find a different lab, because they should have someone on staff that if they do private well analysis, then they should have someone on staff that can answer those questions. And yeah, and make sure you're satisfied with your lab before you commit to one. And then they should also provide you all the information you need, bottles, sampling procedures, all that stuff. So as far as interpreting results, there are websites out there, and I'm going to show you one. Actually, I'm going to show you, yeah. But in the end, you should take it to a qualified health professional, either your doctor or your local health department, and ask them what your water sample results mean. We can certainly look at anyone's water samples that they would want us to. We really just follow what's considered safe by the Safe Drinking Water Act. But especially certain things like if the water is high in chloride or TDS, you may have a little bit of salt water, or the water may be high in sodium as well, and that matters to some people who are on low sodium diets, for instance. So it's better to take it to someone who can talk to you about your health risks if there's an issue. If you do find something, most people really don't do this, but you can resample to confirm. Labs can make mistakes. All of a sudden, if you have a really high value of something where several people in your area have a low value of that, it could have been just a mistake at the lab. But if you do find coliform bacteria, then you should also test for E. coli. Coliform is not harmful to us, but E. coli is. And if you have one, a lot of times you may have the other. And you can boil your water if it's a bacteria problem until you can chlorinate your well, and then test again and make sure that you've gotten rid of that. So what tool I want to show you, this is actually New Hampshire's version. So New Hampshire developed this Be Well Informed guide and tool, and now this is available for, I think, 10 states. And I apologize, I meant to change these slides. But ECOS, the Environmental Council of the States, has got the source code and worked with the EPA with the blessing from the New Hampshire Department of Environmental Services, and developed a version of this for 10 different states, where the states have volunteered to provide information so that it's more appropriate for that state's well owners in specific situation. but I'm going to show you this example. It works the same way. You click on the bottom in the green where it says enter your water test results. So I entered 15 for arsenic and micrograms per liter. The one nice thing about this over some of the older types of websites that have this kind of information, they make you convert it to milligrams per liter. They don't allow you to put in a number and then put in the units to make sure you've got it right. So if your sample comes back from the lab in some other unit, not milligrams per liter, you have to convert it yourself. And we know that's a problem for folks. It's easy to slip a 0 or a digit. So it's an advantage in that respect. So I just typed that in and it gave me a red X. Arsenic 15 milligrams per liter or micrograms per liter, which is 0.015 milligrams per liter and the standard is 0.01. So the standard is 10 micrograms per liter. And so it says it exceeds the drinking water standard. And so the other nice thing about this is it recommends treatment based on the constituents it found in your water. So in this case, POU unit, point of use for absorptive media or for RO, reverse osmosis. And this matters in the case of, we have cases where someone will just have someone run a litmus test on their water to show that it's a little acidic. And from that alone, they may get sold treatment equipment that they don't need or that doesn't really change their water quality. You need to do a full water analysis on your water before you add any kind of treatment. Because if you don't understand that first, you may be getting the wrong type of equipment, or it may not be as effective because of other constituents that interfere, all that sort of stuff. But this is one way you can put in your results and it'll give you an idea of what kind of treatment you need. There's also a really good guide from Minnesota called Well Water Treatment that lists which types of treatment take out what types of contaminants. And I should have showed that here, but I don't have that on there. And further down the page, it just got more information. The treatment options where it says NSF ANSI standard 53 or NSF ANSI standard 58. I just want to mention that if you do buy any kind of treatment equipment, make sure that it has an NSF, a Underwriters Lab, a UL, or a Water Quality Gold Seal on it. That means it was tested by a third-party certifier to remove that contaminant. If you buy treatment equipment that hasn't been certified by a third party, one of those 3 organizations, then you don't know if it's actually going to work. If it has been certified, it's guaranteed to do what it says it'll do. And you'll notice if you look for treatment equipment, you might see, just for RO units, you might see some that are $200 all the way up to $2,000. Probably somewhere around $500 or $600, they'll start being certified, where you'll see that they've been tested and that they have at least one of those symbols on them. It's like the UL that's on your light bulbs, right? They certify those bulbs are going to do what they say they'll do, and UL doesn't put their marker on it unless they've tested them and shown that, yes, this works the way it's supposed to. Again, these are tools. They're only a guide. Sometimes groundwater quality can be really odd, if you will. It doesn't fit, so to speak. And, you still want to take your sample to a health professional, your results, and make sure they understand and you understand what you got going on, if there is anything. And all that said, many wells and many groundwater situations, your water is perfectly safe to drink. There is no issue. But again, you don't know if you don't test. It's not just a well and groundwater issue sometimes. Lead, copper can be in their premise plumbing. You can also have bacteria that get into your hot water heater or your home and form biofilms. And, they can lead to those bacterial issues they can make folks sick. So, yeah, you should always test. That's the bottom line. As far as treatment, there's really two reasons you have treatment, either health effects or cosmetic issues. Stains porcelain, it smells or has a weird color. And so don't assume because it has, whatever it might be, test first and know what's going on. And then you also need to make sure when you add treatment, you know what it actually does and doesn't treat. I do want to say that rarely, if ever, will you need a whole house purification system. As far as for some things, I guess you do, it's like you use a softener, or you may have a filter, but for things like arsenic, it's not a dermal problem, it's only an ingestion problem. And so there's no reason to have a whole house arsenic system. It wastes a lot of water, it's a lot more expensive when if you're using it, you should be using it just for your drinking water and cooking. And that is best served by having a system under your kitchen sink. And I just wanted to expand on that a little more, I guess. So there are examples, like I said, iron filter to keep iron from staining your sinks and a softener, but like RO units or other things, there's really not a reason to have a whole house system. So, and we asked some health professionals about this, even at levels into the hundreds of parts per billion. So if you had arsenic at 150 or 200 ppb, which is rare, but it does occur, that's not a risk for you taking a shower or a bath or your clothes or any of those things. It's only a risk for drinking. So as far as maintenance, the one thing you have to do if you add any kind of treatment is you have to maintain it the way the manufacturer says. If you don't do that and you're not strict about it, you risk those membranes or filters or whatever it might be getting clogged, not working properly, or becoming a place to harbor bacteria. A filter that's left too long will eventually clog, and those filters then become a source of biofilms and some of those things. So I actually had a water professional recommend that I don't even talk about treatment or have a lesson in our class about treatment, because in his experience, he finds more homes where the treatment device hasn't been taken care of, and it's actually the source of the contamination, usually bacterial, than those that actually maintain things like they're supposed to. And so that's, if you're going to add treatment or if you have treatment, make sure you're doing all the maintenance you need to do and replacing things on a schedule like they're supposed to be. So a little bit about the private well class. I'm going to assume, which is usually the case when we ask this question, that most of you have not signed up for the 10 lesson class. You should. It's a good background information, even if you're a professional. But you just click on take our free class and it takes you to a page where you sign up with your email address, first name, and what state you live in, and that's really to count beans for our grant that we can show we're working all over the country. And it'll start sending you a lesson once a week for 10 weeks via email. It's a PDF. And there's a quiz at the beginning, quiz at the end. It's voluntary, but it's really worthwhile, and it goes into a lot more detail than we can here today. This is the page. You just sign up that way, and it'll start sending you a lesson. For each of the lessons in our resources library, we have a set of published documents from other folks. So like for the science of groundwater is the first lesson in our class. Each of the lessons are 6 to 10 pages long, and so like the chapter of a book. And then we refer to some of these other documents, but they're available through this website. And if what's in the lesson we provided doesn't resonate with you, likely one of these will. They don't all have the same information, but they all have at least something related to the topic in that lesson. In the same way with, lesson 2 here, groundwater and well contamination. The first one in Michigan Flowing Well Handbook, it's really detailed. If you have a flowing well or in an area where there are flowing wells, why that occurs, how to cap a well that way. You know, Michigan was losing 28 million gallons a day of groundwater to flowing wells. So they passed some rules to require those to be capped and put out this really nice handbook that follows all things related to that topic. So we do webinars every month, like the one today that's listed there. And some of them are for well owners and some are more for professionals, like outreach strategies. When working with private well owners is really about how, you know, a local extension or health department or a lab or whoever technical assistance provider strategies we've learned. We actually did a study from CDC funding to look at outreach strategies, and we'll present all that next month. We do a septic webinar once a year, usually in July, and we have a septic expert from RCAP actually participate in that and help answer questions. And some of these get repeated another time each year. We also work with real estate professionals. We've done a few for labs. We did 2 related to lead, especially early on. So one of them was in 2016, and then we did this one in 2018. There's no reason to do a new one. This video is available on our website. It really covers all the issues related to lead and private wells. You know, it's not a well issue. It's a premise plumbing issue. So if your home has lead pipes or galvanized pipe or copper pipes with lead solder, if your water is aggressive, then you have or corrosive in any way, then especially when it's sitting stagnant, it can leach that lead or copper into the water. And so that's there's also a web page, which is privatewellclass.org/lead with resources. If you're interested in looking into that further. Well, I mentioned we do a webinar usually every July. We did it last year, it was in August, it got pushed, but on septic systems, and the most popular one we have every year. We have more people show up to that than any of the others. There's a series of short videos. What should I do about a shared well? What do I do after a fire or a flood? What is a drilled well? What is a bedrock aquifer? Just single topic, 4 to 6 minute webinars or videos explaining those topics so that it just gives you a better idea. Just like shared wells, I had no idea there were so many people on shared wells around the country. It happens a lot more frequently than I realized. And really the big issue is a lot of times there's no real agreement, no legal binding agreement or nothing on paper for sharing that well. So if the person who owns the property where the well's located moves or sells or just gets tired of that, then the next person may not want to share the well, or a pump fails and you have no agreement in place, and now you have neighbors who are fighting over who's going to pay for it. It's just better. There's just a lot more issues than I realized. Why does my well keep losing pressure? And another one is, how does my pressure tank work? By far the most popular video we have. It's been viewed over 400 and some odd thousand times. And what it tells us is that a lot of folks have pressure issues with pressure in their water in their home, which could be they don't have their pressure switch set the right way, or maybe they have an undersized pressure tank. But it's yeah, and that there's not a lot of advice out there because it certainly gets a lot of traffic. We started a podcast a few years ago. It's called Tap Talk, and I thought I put the web page on here, and I guess I didn't. It's drinkingwaterpodcast.org. It's about drinking water in rural America, basically. So we bring on here Dr. Alan Wolf is a pediatrician with Boston Children's Hospital. He deals with extreme cases where, odd cases of children's health, and sometimes that leads back to private wells. Brian Swistock recently retired, but he ran Pennsylvania's private well education program through Penn State Extension, one of the best programs in the country for outreach and education to well owners. So it's just a variety of people related to water topics. And if you're into podcasts, I think we just released episode 30 for season 3. And yeah, that'll just continue. We find more people to talk to, and it's always interesting. So the whole point of our program is really about helping well owners become more aware. Just that simple. You should understand your well log if you have it, where your water is coming from, how much casing do you have? I mentioned that earlier. We didn't talk about well construction today, but 2 wells that are both 200 feet deep, one's a bedrock well, that might only have 30, 40 feet of casing, whereas a sand and gravel well that's 200 feet deep has a screen at the bottom to let the water in and keep the sand out. That means the water is coming from the bottom of the well at 195 to 200 feet. So those are very different distances from the surface. So knowing those things, your water level, where your pump's set, are all important. If you have a screen or not, right? Or if it's a large diameter well, what that means. Also understanding that there could be natural occurring contaminants and what kind of water quality issues are there associated with your water source or your aquifer or in your area. And the other goal I'd say is for you to learn enough about your well and how your well works that you're able to ask better questions when you have a problem. Because in most cases, if I get a phone call, it's from someone who has a problem with their well or needs to replace something on their well. People don't just call to tell me that their well's working fine. And so knowing the situation better, understanding why you might have these problems, sometimes you might be able to solve it yourself and save yourself some money than having to hire a contractor to come out and fix something for you, all those sorts of things. And then lastly, sample your well. It's still a fact that a lot of folks have never sampled their well. They just assume because it's groundwater, it's safe, and that's just not necessarily true. Again, all groundwater certainly is not contaminated, but you don't know for sure what's going on with your particular water supply unless you test. So the goal of our program, I guess, is really to help, as I said, understand why your well is important, why you need to understand how it works, and how you can then use that to help protect yourself from risk. And so, yeah, so we had a lot of questions today. We're going to answer some of those, but we certainly can't answer all of them. And so I think that's where we're headed next here. Yeah. This is from an old slide. I apologize. This should say Katie will take your questions today. Through the end, again, through the question or chat box, if you have that on your GoToWebinar screen, you can, we'll pull those up at the end and take a look after we answer these questions. So the first one, and I'm going to read these so it's clear. My local certified testing service in Oregon offers a new well testing for arsenic, coliform, nitrate, pH, and conductivity. Or should I pay $30 per additional test, I'm assuming, for all these other things, arsenic, antimony, barium, blah, blah, blah. I'm in the Cascade Mountains, 400-foot deep well, 200 feet from this river. So really, you should check with your state agency that deals with groundwater quality I mentioned before to see if any of those are issues in your region. It's, you shouldn't have, there's no reason to test for cyanide, for instance, or mercury unless there's a known issue or something could be that way, and it's not likely. And so some of those aren't even metals, but what we think, and Walt Kelly, I forgot to mention earlier, is the head of our groundwater section. He's a geochemist. He answered some of these questions that I'm reading today. But the really most important things in that list would be arsenic, fluoride, and nitrate. They're much more common. They're all, well, certainly the arsenic and fluoride could be naturally occurring. And his guess is that this is a list of elements that have primary drinking water standards. So they have an MCL for the Safe Drinking Water Act. So it's not necessarily to do all those. The ones at the top certainly are a good idea. Whether it's worth doing any of those, you should find out first if there's any risk in your area that's known, because it's just not likely that you need to test for most of those things. like chromium. I mean, unless you know there's a source, you wouldn't need to test for it. So I graphed the main biological tests which are common for drinking water and wells, but what other unexpected biologics should also be tested? For example, during heavy spring rains, our sump pump, whose basin is inside the house, develops a terrible sewage smell that we must mitigate for months. Then it just goes away. Are there similar biologics in the soil that might make their way down to the aquifer level? The fact that your sump smells like sewage is actually, this is a concern that this is from your septic. I would, the next time you have this issue, I would take a sample of the water and get it tested for coliform E. coli, because I don't really know a source in the soil that would cause this sort of thing just after heavy rains. And so I think it has to be something's being pushed because of the heavy rain from your septic or your septic field, and you want to investigate that. So I guess to answer your question, I don't know of any similar biologics in the soil that might do that. Yeah. Zinc and copper. Part of my job is to inspect tourist rooming houses, and I have one that did the required yearly well test. We only require testing for coliforms, but the property owner had some additional tests run, and the water sample came back high in zinc and copper. The recommendation by the tech at the state lab was to run the water for 5 minutes and retest. She did, and then the copper and zinc levels were in a normal range. She wanted to know what would cause those initial high levels. So this is a huge issue. Copper, zinc, lead, that's the whole lead issue that's going on around the country, is because lead pipes will leach lead into the water if they're a little bit corrosive or majorly corrosive. So water can either be corrosive or it can be scale forming. And I know we have a lab that works with all the state buildings, all the government buildings and things like that, the prisons, where they recommend what they need to do for treatment to keep their water at a point where it's not scale forming or corrosive, keeping it right in the right spot, so to speak. And so if your water is a little corrosive, then when it sits in your pipes, if there's lead, zinc, copper available, it'll leach into the water. And so, in fact, when you have to test for a public water supply in a home for lead or copper, it has to be stagnant for 5-6 hours because they want to see the higher level if there is one. And so, it's, for a while, it was just a recommendation that if you had lead pipes, let your water run for 5 minutes before you get a drink of water. That's really, it's not that it's poor advice, but it's not practical advice. No one who wants to get a glass of water is going to stand there for 5 minutes every time. And so the best way is to treat it, obviously. But the longer it sits, then the more metal that could be leached out of it. And so that's likely what's going on here. I'm pretty sure that's what's going on. And zinc's associated both with galvanized piping and solder. It's a component of lead solder. And so I'm guessing that this home has copper pipes since you had copper and zinc. And so it's the solder, likely from soldering the pieces of copper together, and the copper is coming from the copper pipe itself. I would ask them to go back and sample for lead, and talk to your state agency about the best way to treat for that. They should probably consider treatment at the tap to remove those things. Because again, someone who's coming to a rooming house isn't going to know that that's an issue, and they're going to take the first draw of water that comes out if they're using it like to fill up a pan or whatever. High iron. So is my water safe to drink with high iron? It is. There's no primary drinking water standard for iron. It can cause a taste if it's really high. It just doesn't taste very good. And it also does have a secondary MCL. So the primary drinking water standards or the primary MCLs are health-based. The secondary ones are for aesthetics like staining, taste, odor. And so it does have a secondary standard for staining and scale formation. So, it's best to remove the iron because it is going to cause staining. And if it is really high, it might have a taste, but it doesn't sound like that's the case in your case. The other thing we find is, well, yeah, I'll leave it at that. When the land is surrounded by decades of modern farming, will water from a shallow well ever be safe to drink? So really, we get this question a lot about pesticides and their well being close to a farm field. It really depends on three things. It depends on the construction of the well. Is it properly constructed? And the type of well. The geology in the area. If it's an old dug well that's only 25 feet deep, then it's likely going to have surface contamination, whatever that might be. And also the location of the aquifer providing the water. So is the water coming from, in the case of an old large diameter well, it's probably coming from just whatever materials at the surface or near the surface, versus if it's a 200-foot sand and gravel well with the screen at 195 to 200 and it's properly constructed and properly grouted, then it really shouldn't matter if the geology is such that the well has, or the aquifer could have a clay layer above it, for instance, that protects it from surface infiltration. And so in that case, there would be no issue. You probably never find high nitrate or pesticides. I know we did a study I mentioned earlier with the dug wells. We also sampled in other areas where there was a different depth to aquifer, and in the area where the aquifer was greater than 150 feet with clay above it, it's the only place we saw background only levels of nitrate, less than 3 parts per million, and no pesticides whatsoever. And so all those things go into deciding whether or not pesticides may be a problem for your well or ag chemicals. And so, the bottom line is you need to test, but because it's a shallow well, by its very nature, the water is coming from a shallow source, then it's certainly more of a risk than a well that would be deeper in a confined aquifer. So, yeah, in general, that's where we're at. Okay, can groundwater be contaminated by a dry well that was never sealed around the base? It's over 300 feet deep and capped, but there are gaps around the base at ground level because the driller gave up on it and walked off the job without sealing it. So, it certainly can, especially if there's heavy rainfall and there's any water that can run down through those openings. It could wash whatever's on the surface down into the well. So if it's subject to ponding, if it's in a lower area, then that's certainly a problem. And so I'd be careful what you do around the well, and I would try to have it sealed if it's on your property. So regarding the driller, this is just one side of the story. I realize that, but I would call your state agency that licensed drillers and report the situation first, and ask them what should be done. And it depends on your state totally. Some don't even have rules. But if the driller really walked off the job and left and wasn't professional, then I'd file a complaint, or at least contact the driller and say that you're going to file a complaint if they don't come back and fix it. But again, this is one side of the story. I don't know the other side. And so I say all that with a grain of salt. But it really depends on your state what would happen next. If they have a system in place for complaints, I know some states certainly do and can take licenses away and things like that. But again, I only have a little piece of the information to make a good decision on what to do there. So Roundup, which is applied in a lot of places, is glyphosate a concern in well water. I bought a property from someone who used a lot of it. I found a test for it via Simple Lab, an online service. Is Simple Lab reliable? Okay, so it does have an MCL, a primary drinking water standard of 700 ppb under the Safe Drinking Water Act, which means it is a concern and it is a health risk. And so you should test if you believe it could be in your well. Regarding Simple Labs, they are a reliable source for testing. We've worked with them in the past. They have a unique approach by partnering with certified labs around the country. They actually don't do your analysis. They're kind of, they're the organizer and have this nice website where you can decide what you want. And then when you get your sample kit, it actually goes to a certified lab that's near you. And that's already part of their network and has a contract with them. So, you know, we do have a relationship with them. They give us a couple free tests every year during Groundwater Awareness Week. And I want to mention that. And really our advice is always just to use a certified lab, and because we really can't endorse any business per se. But the main point is you want to use a certified lab if you're going to do testing. I had an apparent well cave in after a major storm. Will the water be safe to drink after it clears, or should it be treated? So I need a lot more information to understand how to answer this, and I just wanted to mention that. You know, what kind of well is it? How deep is it? What kind of casing and diameter? How do you know there's a cave in? You said an apparent cave in. It's not something we see very often, and I don't know if it's an old dug well, that makes more sense. But regardless, you certainly need to test the water before you drink it. And, you know, this is not a common occurrence. So what I'd prefer is you email us and we can start a thread to figure out a little more about what's going on. So, all right. Sulfur bacteria. This is a very common problem around the US. Our well has been overrun by sulfur bacteria for 7+ years. Water smells like rotten eggs and stains the porcelain. Though I don't know that the sulfur is actually the reason their porcelain's being stained. It could very well be iron bacteria is in there as well, and it's iron that's staining your porcelain. We have a water purifier system and softener. My dad stopped paying to maintain the filter system years ago. He was replacing the 2 filters, but they can no longer filter the smell and taste, but only a few days versus 2 or 3 months. Is a chlorine shock process that's needed. So this is actually, if it's this bad, where it used to, you know, filter used to work, and now it's only a few days and it stops working, then there's likely a pretty significant growth in your well. And once it gets in there, it's really hard to get out. So you probably need to actually mechanically clean your well, and they'd be pulling the pump. And there's contractors who then use brushes and agitate the water with chlorine and then do it again. And you're trying to clean all that out of your well to start with. It's also probably likely in your hot water heater. I know one of the recommendations is if you can turn your water heater up to like 160, it'll kill the bacteria. But given the severity and the likelihood that it would come back, even if you were to get it all cleaned out, you're probably going to want to use continuous chlorination like a community water supply does, and have a chlorinator that's in your system, and then aerate so that you can get rid of the smell before it gets to your pressure tank, likely. So Minnesota has a really good guide, and Katie's going to put this in the chat, I think. I think I sent that to you. If not, I will at the end. But it's just about this hydrogen sulfide issue, and whether it's bacteria, there's other potential sources as well. How can I find out the location of my well? I moved in a house, but the previous owner is not able to locate the well. If the well's buried, then it's really going to be difficult unless the casing is near the surface and it's metal, which it's much more likely that it's an older well, possibly a large diameter well. If it's buried, you don't see this happen with a drilled well that's more modern. And so the only thing I can think of is using a soil probe. I know that's something people do to find their septic tanks a lot, because a lot of people don't know where their septic system is. But, and yeah, I don't know, have any other recommendations other than if you know where your pipes are coming in your home, it's probably, it's more than likely that it's a straight line to your well. And so that's how I would try to find it. Yeah, it's an unusual problem. So, I mean, a well log, or, you know, even if there's a well log on file with your state for the home, it isn't going to have the detail to tell you where your well's at in all likelihood. So I think the only thing you have to do is, yes, is start probing to see if you can find it. I forgot to change the title here. Sorry about that. What do you think about the solar power well pumps, and what would we need to do to update our electric well pump to solar? So, you know, I mentioned earlier that I work with some of the RCAP folks who are also doing assessments and working with private well owners every day. And so we have a small work group. There's 6 or 7 of us that whenever we come across a problem or a question that we're not sure of, we bounce it off the other folks in the group. And this actually came up this last week about solar. And so what we learned from a number of the RCAP folks is that it's likely going to be cost prohibitive if you have to if you have access to power. It's just a lot more expensive, all the equipment and everything you need to do that. And kind of the general consensus was the only time it really might be worthwhile at this point anyway is when there's no other choice, like you're off the grid and you know, you don't have access to any other power source. I know it's not only it's because of the storing the batteries. It's what happens in the winter, and what do you have for backup? If you happen to deplete your system, you'd have to have a backup, whether that's a generator or whatever. It just, everything that we've found out just suggests that the technology's really not there for at least widespread use. If it was cheaper and easier and reliable, you'd see a lot of people using it, I think. So, I mean, that's my opinion. So, yeah, and I think that's the last question. Yeah, and so let me pull up the questions for today. I need to find Katie's email real quick.
Hey, Steve, I could just send you a message in the chat box.
That'd be great. That would work great.
All right, I sent it, so you should be the only one that is able to see it.
Yeah, it came up. That was very helpful. Thank you. Can you see that okay, Katie?
Yeah, but it looks good.
All right. How do I control iron and iron bacteria? It's kind of the same issue as the sulfur bacteria. You need to chlorinate your well. You can try shock chlorinating it. The problem is those bacteria and others form biofilms and grow in your well. And if they've been there a while, it's also, they exist in groundwater just naturally. And so iron bacteria is a different issue than controlling iron, just for one thing. A lot of times when you find sulfur bacteria, you also have iron bacteria mixed in, so to speak. And, you know, so because they use iron as their food source, right? And the sulfur bacteria use sulfur as their food source, which generates that smell. As far as controlling iron, iron's in solution. So there's iron filters. You can also chlorinate or oxidize, oxidizing filters to get the iron out. In some cases, there's so much iron in groundwater that you'd be replacing filters very often. And so they make more advanced systems, which I can't speak to off the top of my head. In those cases, we have seen a few here in Illinois where just an iron filter doesn't do it because it's just there's just too much iron in the water. So hopefully that helped. What is the Illinois law on how far the well should be from the septic tank? I think it's 75 feet, but I would have to look it up. It's either 75 or 100. So, but that also, there's other things, right? If there's two properties next to each other, it has to be that far from both, the other one too. And yeah, if a home tested positive for total coliform and E. coli, one of 3 separate occasions within a 2-month period after hurricane floods and treatment of the entire well, the house system, including changing of holding tank, what options may be available to them? Oh my gosh. Let me read this again. So
I think it says on 3 separate occasions, Steve. It's supposed to say on 3 separate occasions, not one of 3.
oh, I bet it is on 3 separate occasions. There you go. Thank you. So, well, what we tell folks is that sometimes when you treat, there's other things that could be at play here. So it depends on how you treated it, what process you followed. You know, we recommend using Minnesota's guide for shock chlorination, and you know, you're mixing water up in advance to a certain concentration. You're mixing it in the well and then running it through the well before you do anything else, and then you're running it through all the pipes in your home, and you leave it sit overnight. Because, you know, I know there was a question that I'm not going to answer today. I didn't plan on anyway, saying that is putting chlorine pellets in my well once a month okay for treating my well? And it isn't. You need to follow the right process. And so the other things that could be occurring here is if your water has a pH that's over 8, then chlorine's fairly ineffective. And this is an issue we talk about a lot because there's not great guidance out there on what to do in those cases. Some folks have recommended using hydrogen peroxide instead of chlorine. That's a little more dangerous. It can burn your skin and stuff, and it's not as well known a process. We know you can use white vinegar to lower the pH in your well to make the chlorine more effective, because chlorine actually raises the pH when it's mixed in. I guess I need to know, you know, those are some reasons why it might not work. If your well, I guess one question would be, do you know if your well had coliform or E. coli before the hurricane floods? Because the other thing that can happen is over time, coliform and E. coli and other bacteria get in these biofilms and they're layered. And when you chlorinate a well, you may kill the outer layer, but it doesn't do anything to what's below that. And so you might have to do it 3 or 4 times to have any success. And because we do see this once in a while. I don't know how many times you actually, if you only treated it once, which is what I'm reading. Yeah, that's the only advice I have is to check those things. If you want to send us an email, then I can follow up and we can learn a little bit more about that. I mean, how many times have you actually chlorinated it? What process did you use? Is there a way that you can, I think they have even, the one thing that I would say using a home kit for would be for pH, like at a pool store. because pH is such a big deal for people keeping their pools the way they want them. The pH tests are pretty good. You could get a pH test and find out what the pH of your water is, and that might be a clue. But otherwise, just contact us. That'll help a lot. How or where does one dispose of spent filter media, especially if it contains concentrated levels of arsenic? You know, that's a state-dependent question. Some states have rules about that. You know, technically, it probably cannot go in to your garbage. You'd have to talk to your state agency, or actually, what I would probably do is contact the company that makes your arsenic treatment system and ask them how you dispose of it, because they should be able to tell you. If it's not in your manual, even your instruction manual, and you know, today that's likely online. If you know your model and all that stuff, you can probably just find your instruction manual online if you don't know where it's at. Okay, so this question looks familiar. How to pour a slab around a well to build a new well house without damaging the seal around the well. I guess I'm not sure. Your well should be sealed already, and it should be grouted in the annulus. And so I don't know, you know, if you have enough stick up, let's say you have 2 feet of stick up on your casing, you should be able to put a 6-inch concrete pad and pour it around the well, and it should not have any effect. Yeah, I don't know. I mean, the seal is on the cap, right? If it's a, you know, I'm most used to like a red monitor cap, where when you take off the 5 bolts, there is a gasket that fits between the 2 pieces. And so when that's sealed, it's as long as your gasket is in place correctly and it's not, you know, brittle because it's set through 10 winters, that should be a good seal. So putting the concrete down below around the casing should not have any effect. And then, you know, if I'm not getting something here, if you email us a picture of what you're talking about, it might help. But I'm assuming you just have, you know, like a 6-inch well casing and it sticks up 18 inches or a foot or 2 foot above the land surface. You should be able to just pour your concrete around it, and you know, it shouldn't affect anything. Yeah. All right. That's what we have for today. Thank you for attending, and we got done a little early today. That's my bad. And yeah, if you have any other questions, here is our email address and our yeah. And if there's a question I didn't answer and you were really counting on an answer, I guess, feel free to email us and I'll get back to you for the rest of those. All right, thank you. Have a good day, everybody. Thanks, Katie.
Thanks, Steve.